Okay, thank you very much, Theo. I'm going to try and keep this to half an hour so that there is plenty of time for discussion. But there's a lot to say on this issue. Earlier this week, before Trump had won the presidency in the US, then a capitalist commentator called Wolfgang Munchau, who writes in the Financial Times, wrote an opinion piece which was really about Keynesianism and why the capitalist should adopt Keynesian policies. And it was called How to Quell the Politics of Insurrection. And its starting point was that the capitalist establishment need to figure out how to respond to the growing, what he called insurrectionary politics. And by that, he meant Trump, he meant UKIP, he meant the FN in France, so the right-wing, racist, nationalist populists. But he also meant Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Podemos in Spain, so the growth of left-wing populist ideas. And let's be clear, the capitalists don't ideally like people like Donald Trump winning the presidency of the US, because he's not the best defender of their system. He's not completely under their control, clearly. But nonetheless, they would choose right-wing populists, no matter what racism or nationalism they whip up, that defend the capitalist system every day, before they would choose left-wing populists that potentially can threaten the capitalist system by mobilising working-class people for an alternative. But in this article, he went on to lay the blame for the growth of insurrectionary ideas at the foot of social democracy, of the equivalent of New Labour and all the other parties of that ilk around Europe. And he excoriates them. He says it's their fault because when the financial crisis started, they chose to bail out the bankers and the bondholders, and they embraced austerity. He says that in Germany, the Social Democrats were central to writing support for austerity into the constitution. In Italy, they supported raising taxes for the majority in the middle of a recession. And he says you could sum up the aloof and cynical attitude of Blairism continent-wide by Hollande, the French president, privately mocking the toothless, people who could not afford dental care and as a result had rotting teeth. And he says, with Keynesianists like these, who needs conservatives? The only people who are advocating Keynesian ideas are the hard left and the hard right. And he concluded his article by urging the centre-left, that's the Blairite politicians, to return to their Keynesian roots, because if they don't, there is a good chance that insurrection, and by that he means the threat of socialist revolution, will succeed. Now, that was an unusually coherent article, but it's actually not an uncommon argument. Even the IMF, who have been forcing austerity on the globe for decades, are now talking about the need for a return to Keynesianism. And broadly speaking, what they mean by that is increased public investment in order, they would say, to kickstart the economy out of its low growth rut, and they're explicit that the reason to do that is because of growing anger against austerity and inequality around the world, and therefore there should be a turn to Keynesian policies, which could broadly be defined as government intervention into the economy in order to stimulate demand by creating jobs, increasing wages via public investment, with an aim of ameliorating or even preventing capitalist crisis. And after all, even here in Britain, we've got a new Tory Prime Minister who started talking about defending the working class, ending austerity, standing up for the poor. As we all know, words are cheap. As I'll say later, she's continuing with exactly the same policies, but nonetheless has been forced to talk a little bit differently. So you could conclude, and there are supposed left-wing commentators, Paul Mason was mentioned in the rally last night, but he's head of the list on this, who have concluded that what this means is that capitalism wouldn't mind a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government, and that the title of this session is wrong. It's not capitalism versus Corbynomics, because capitalism would love a bit of Corbynomics, and it's only a question of convincing working class people, getting a Labour government, and then they will allow us to implement these policies. After all, it is true that while Jeremy Corbyn's policies have enthused hundreds of thousands of people, and they do represent a break with the endless neoliberalism we've had from all of the major parties over the last decade, £10 an hour, an end to austerity, free education, building council houses, nonetheless, by historical standards, they are actually an extremely modest Keynesian programme. If you look back, he gets compared to 1983, to the programme that Michael Foot stood on as Labour leader at that point in time. But that, for example, called for return to public ownership of the public assets and rights hived off by the Tories, with compensation of no more than that received when the assets were denationalised. So it called for everything that the Tories had privatised at that point, and there's been a lot more privatised by the Tories and New Labour since, to be brought back into public ownership. And that 1983 manifesto was much more modest than what the left of the Labour Party, the Bennites, including Jeremy Corbyn, stood on at that point in time. The alternative economic strategy, a left Keynesian programme if you like, stood for public ownership of the financial institutions and the banks. So the programme that Jeremy is putting forward is modest by the historical standards of his own ideological trend, if you like, and is, formally speaking, not that different to some of the things the IMF are saying governments should start to consider. But I think that we all know that capitalism is desperate to stop Jeremy Corbyn being the leader of the Labour Party and to prevent a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government. Look at the vitriol that has been rained down on him by the supporters of capitalism inside and outside of the Labour Party. The huge efforts that have been made to unseat him. It was Cameron, who of course himself ended up going, standing at the dispatch box in a complete break with parliamentary tradition, saying, just go, man, go, against Jeremy Corbyn. The 172 MPs carrying out the coup, the capitalist courts backing that coup, when it went to the High Court, all of the vitriol that's rained down on him from the capitalist press. It's absolutely clear that they do see him as a threat. And by the way, what we've seen so far is nothing compared to what we would see if Jeremy was to successfully lead a Labour Party to a general election victory, which is entirely possible if he stands firm against austerity. But if that was to happen, the capitalist class would mobilise everything they could to try and prevent him implementing even his modest Keynesian programme. Because look what took place in Greece. Syriza went from less than 5% of the vote to winning a general election. They were standing on a programme even more modest than Jeremy Corbyn's. Because actually, all they stood for was stopping the misery. No more austerity. We've had enough after all of the misery that the Greek people had suffered. And global capitalism did everything it could to bring the Syriza government to its knees and to convince it to implement austerity. They had particular weapons. The fact that Greece was part of the Eurozone, a weak economy, but it would be very naive to imagine that in the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, if Jeremy Corbyn wasn't elected, that capitalism wouldn't be desperate to make sure that he also betrayed, as Syriza did, and went ahead and implemented austerity rather than introducing his programme. That doesn't mean he couldn't do it, as I will go on to explain. He absolutely could, just as Syriza could have stood firm as the Greek people did, instead of capitulating. But the questions that I want to address in this session, before I come to that, is why the capitalist class, if they're talking about Keynesianism on the one hand, on the other hand, are so opposed to Jeremy Corbyn winning a general election and implementing his policy. The essence of Paul Mason's mistake, and not only him but the others, in his article where he talks, as Peter said last night, about the Trotskyists and the bondholders and the financiers needing to take to the streets together against right-wing populism, Trump, UKIP and the rest of it. But the essence of the mistake in his article was summed up in one sentence, where he said it is entirely possible to create a humane, pro-business version of capitalism without austerity, inequality, privatisation, financial corruption, asset bubbles and technocratic hubris. That's his real mistake, by imagining that that can be done. And that, by the way, from somebody supposedly on the left, goes further than Tom Watson's speech at Labour Party conference in defence of Blairism and capitalism. It is against the essence of why the Labour Party was founded a century ago, where it was precisely because so-called liberal capitalism, the Liberal Party at that point in time, could not meet the needs of the working class, that working class people drew the conclusion they had to fight their own party, found their own party which would fight for the transformation of society, for socialism, and that was what they were doing when they began to instigate the Labour Party. Capitalism, this is a basic point, but it's the fundamentals. Capitalism is an economic system which has the exploitation of the working class at its heart. Profit, its driving force, as Marx explained over 150 years ago, comes from the exploitation of working class people, the unpaid labour of the working class. And from that flows all of the inequalities of capitalism. Exploiting us is in its DNA. It's not something that can be changed. Now we're told that it's outdated to continue to think in terms of classes, that the traditional working class no longer exists, and Paul Mason, John Harris, Owen Jones, they all make these kinds of points. Have you got a seat, Mary?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just disrupt everybody, I'm sorry.
I think we're getting the overflow of the people who couldn't fit in the micro-crit session. But, you know, look at the reality. The gap between the rich and poor in society today, the top and the bottom, is bigger now than at any time in human history. You all know this statistic. But according to Oxfam, the richest 62 people on the planet own more than the poorest 50% of the world's population. That is a greater inequality than there has ever been. And far from the working class no longer existing, traditionally more middle class sections of society are being driven down to the level of the working class and are being forced to adopt working class methods of struggle. What is it when the junior doctors organise mass picket lines, other than sections who previously would have seen themselves as part of the middle class, adopting the working class's methods of struggle? And new technology, and this is the irony, or the ultimate condemnation of modern capitalism, new technology is used not to benefit the whole of humanity, but in order to increase the profits for a few at the top, while they drive the rest of us down. And that means not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector. Previously more middle class professions like architecture and lawyers, accountants, increasingly are becoming people who sit at a computer screen, working a programme, being paid peanuts, as their jobs are de-skilled. That's previously middle class professions. Never mind what is happening to those of us in working class professions. The gig economy. What's the gig economy? Other than using new technology to return to the Victorian era. So instead of standing on the London docks, waiting desperately to see if you can get a day's work as a docker, now you're sitting in your house waiting for your smartphone, the app to beep at you, but to do exactly the same thing, to go and get a few hours work which you don't know from day to day whether you will have. Capitalism has always meant the exploitation of the working class. And even in boom time, in the good times, the working class cannot afford to buy back the full product, the things that we make, the full product of our labour, because we're not paid enough. But in periods of growth, capitalism temporarily overcomes that by investment, by driving the economy forward, which in turn creates new factories, new workplaces, and so on. But at a certain stage, all the old contradictions reappear. Capitalism is an inherently unstable system. That is always the case. Riven by contradictions, swinging from boom to slump. But today, levels of investment are at historically low levels. That was the case before the economic crisis and has continued to be the case. And broadly speaking, there'll be much more detailed discussion on the world economy in other sessions. Capitalism is increasingly a system in crisis that has not recovered from the crisis in 2008. Booms have become weaker, slumps have become deeper. We're in the worst crisis since the 1930s. And even in the period before 2008, and let's remember in Britain since 2008, wages have fallen by 10%. That's the biggest fall of any economically advanced country apart from Greece. But even before that, the growth in inequality has continued for 20 or 30 years as neoliberalism let rip around the world. So in Britain, for example, the share of after-tax income received by the top 1% of taxpayers rose from 4% in 1978 to 10% by 2000. At the same time, the share of national income of the bottom 3/5 of the population fell from 40 to 33% between 1977 and 2008. So in those supposed good years, our share was going down while the rich were taking more. That's been the nature of capitalism over decades. Now, the more thinking sections of the capitalist class, the likes of Munchau, who I quoted at the beginning, seeing the rise of revolt against that inequality, against the consequences of the capitalist system, are panicking that capitalism itself could be overthrown. And that's why they're looking around for different alternatives. At the same time, they face a new phase of economic crisis. We haven't recovered from 2008, and a new phase of crisis is developing. And after 2008, it wasn't the same as after 1929, the world economic crash that took place then. This time, the capitalists did intervene globally. They coordinated their efforts to try and limit the effects of the crisis. So they did carry out a kind of Keynesianism, but it was Keynesianism for the rich. It was Keynesianism for the bankers and the bondholders. QE, for example. If quantitative easing in Britain had been given to us, every family in Britain would have had an extra £24,000 to spend since 2008. And that would have done more, by the way, to ameliorate the crisis than giving it to the banks who held on to it and waited for better times. But quantitative easing, very low interest rates, pumping money into the economy by all kinds of means, they did have some effect on limiting the economic crisis and particularly in restoring the profits of the rich. But those methods have been used up. Another economic crisis, they know they can't just keep doing the same thing. And so that's the other reason that they're discussing and considering maybe they have to have a turn to more traditional Keynesianism, things like a New Deal of investing in infrastructure and so on, in order to try and counter the effects of the next stage of the economic crisis. But all these discussions by the IMF, in the Financial Times, all of the rest of them, they're discussing how to save capitalism, to save their system. That's what they're interested in. And they fear Jeremy Corbyn because rightly they see the movement that's developed behind him, that's pushed him into the leadership of the Labour Party, as a potential threat to their system. Because it's an expression of all of the accumulated anger of what capitalism has meant over the last decade. And they fear a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government came to power, it would not limit itself just to implementing the relatively modest programme that Jeremy has put forward so far, but that the workers' appetites would be awakened and the pressure from below could force Jeremy to go much further and to introduce far-reaching socialist measures which would threaten the capitalist system itself. That's what they're frightened of, and that is why they are desperate to prevent Jeremy Corbyn coming to power and implementing his programme. So even though it seems a contradiction that they talk about Keynesianism and yet they oppose Jeremy Corbyn for putting forward a Keynesian programme, it's not a contradiction, because it's the difference between chatting about a Keynesian method as a means of protecting the profits of the capitalist class and saving the capitalist system, and somebody being pushed to implement policies because of the anger of the working class who are moving towards opposition to that system and a search for a socialist alternative. We would also add that while it's true that the IMF and the Financial Times are having nice cosy chats about implementing Keynesian policies, capitalists are not actually doing it at this point in time. Theresa May's talk has certainly not been backed up by action. On the contrary, the introduction of the benefit cap has gone ahead. Huge cuts are being threatened to the National Health Service, which are likely to lead to a revolt. There may be some investment in infrastructure announced in the autumn spending review, but even if that comes, it will be combined with continued austerity for the rest of us. But the worsening government financial figures mean they may not even announce the kind of infrastructure spending that they had previously been talked about. And generally, capitalist governments are actually reluctant to implement the IMF's advice. Many Keynesians look back approvingly to what was called the New Deal in the US, which was a big Keynesian pump priming of the economy at that point in time. And they say that's a starting point for what's needed today. But Trotsky said about the New Deal that at that point in time, the US was the only capitalist country on the planet which could afford to implement the New Deal. It could not have been done in other countries. And today, even though the US is still the biggest capitalist power on the planet, it is not the power it was then. It is a declining world power with enormous debts, which is less able to implement the kind of New Deal that was implemented in the 1930s. Trump's talking about it, isn't it? He's talking about huge infrastructure investment. Let's see if supposedly his own party, the Republicans, let him put that through, because that is very far from certain. They are likely to try and block it because US capitalism is very hesitant about going down the road of serious Keynesian measures at this point in time. Why is that? First of all, you've got to get the money from somewhere to implement Keynesian policies, and the ultra-rich could certainly afford to pay more over to the government to fund Keynesian policies, but they're not going to agree to that, including Trump, of course, who himself is in favour of cutting taxes to the rich. They will fight that tooth and nail. And so that is not an easy road to go down for the implementation of Keynesian policies. At the same time, the Keynesianism for the rich that took place after 2008 was really a nationalisation of the debts of capitalism, of the finance system, and has left governments enormously indebted. Any serious attempt to introduce Keynesian policies on the basis of borrowing would massively increase those debts, and that could then trigger a new stage of the world economic crisis as the markets punish the government that does it first. So capitalism itself makes it very difficult for them to go down the road of a Keynesian solution. And the final point I would add is that no national government, including the US, wants to be the first to take all of those risks for the greater good of capitalism as a whole. Everybody's ringtone sounds like that, so there's no way of knowing, is it? For the greater good of capitalism as a whole, when it won't necessarily be their national capitalism that gains from it. Let's say, hypothetically, Trump manages to get a massive infrastructure programme through the different aspects of US government and starts to implement it. That leads to workers being taken on and given jobs in the Rust Belt of the US, at least to some degree. Those workers will then have more money in their pockets. They're going to buy US goods.
or they're going to buy Chinese goods or Indian goods. So it will not necessarily be US capitalism that would get the benefit from such a policy, even if it was implemented. And they're aware of that, and therefore are also very hesitant about going down the road of Keynesian policies. We should also add here, it's not true that Keynesianism would solve the problems of capitalism. That's the idea that is put forward by many on the left. It's just a question of policy. They implement neoliberal policies. If they switch to Keynesian policies, everything would be marvellous, because it would stimulate demand, it would kickstart the economy, the capitalists would then start investing, and it would all be brilliant. I mean, let's be clear. Vicious austerity, which has cut demand, which has put less money in our pockets, at a time of economic crisis, was not objectively the best means for capitalism to limit the effects of that economic crisis. It was stupid from many points of view. But that doesn't mean that Keynesianism would have solved the economic crisis. Let's remember, for a whole period before 2008, then we did have money in our pockets, not as a result of Keynesian policies, but as a result of a world credit boom. We were remortgaging our houses, we had credit cards, we had money via those means. The population was living on debt, but then we were spending, we were buying goods. That did not result in an increase in increased investment by capitalism overall, because they still did not see a means to make a profit from it as a result of the sickness of their own system. So it doesn't follow they will successfully kickstart investment as a result of Keynesian policy, because in the end, the capitalists will only invest where they can see the possibility of making a profit. Does that rule out the implementation of serious Keynesian measures by the capitalist class at some point in time? Absolutely not. It doesn't rule it out. What is ruled out is the idea that somehow then being forced to implement Keynesian policies would lead to a return of the post-war upswing, the period between about 1950 and 1973, where most capitalist governments did introduce Keynesian policies, and where there was historic growth, and the working class got some crumbs from the table, and we did win a national health service, a welfare state, all of the things that they've been taking off us since. But the two things are not cause and effect. We did not have the post-war economic upswing because of Keynesian policies. On the contrary, it was a number, which I don't have time to deal with now in any detail, of different factors which are not about to be repeated. Primarily, the increased strength of the working class at the end of the Second World War, and at that stage, linked to that, the existence and the strengthening of the Soviet Union, which, even though it was a very distorted form of a planned economy, a brutal dictatorship, was nonetheless a threat to the capitalist system, and meant when the working class rose up in countries like Britain and said, we want a national health service, capitalism thought, we better give it them or they might go over to the other side. There was a kind of existential threat which forced them to act at that point in time. In addition, there was also, the major capitalist powers were forced to coordinate together under the leadership of the US because of the threat of the Soviet Union in a way that they simply are not today. Today they are again, more and more, all at each other's throat. And of course, in addition to that, for a temporary period, the increased demand, combined with the implementation of new methods of production, which had mostly existed from the 30s, but could only be implemented after the carnage of the Second World War, meant that there was a period of growth for capitalism. Since that brief golden age ended in the 1970s, the capitalist class have set out to take back everything that was given at that point in time. And yes, they can be forced to adopt some temporary Keynesian measures, but they will be to manage capitalist crisis. They will not mean a return to the era that existed after the post-war upswing. Keynes himself said that his theories were designed to avoid revolution. And frankly, it will only be the threat of revolution, of working class people taking power, that will force the capitalist class to adopt some Keynesian policies. but they will do all they can to prevent a left-led government implementing Keynesian policies. I've talked about Syriza and Greece already, but there are many other examples from history that I don't have time to fully deal with here. Perhaps people can come in the discussion and I can comment on it at the end. I'm not quite old enough to remember this. I was alive but not politically conscious. But in 1981, then there was a left government elected under Mitterrand in France on a programme which included a 10% increase in the minimum wage, the introduction of a 39-hour week, widespread nationalisation, increasing pensions. They were elected overwhelmingly. People took to the streets celebrating the fantastic thing that had taken place in France. Initially, in the first days, they started to implement some of their programme. Capitalism globally attacked, the world markets attacked. Within 100 days, they were implementing austerity. On a much smaller scale, a Labour government in Britain from 74 to 76 attempted to introduce increased taxation on the major corporations and the rich, and it was just subject to ferocious attack, and it was amended out of existence. It was never implemented. So they will try and stop us, and it does not bode well for what is necessary to implement a socialist programme. That unfortunately, Jeremy is at the moment attempting again to pacify the Blairites, the capitalists in the Labour Party, because we're not going to win anything by pacifying the forces that support capitalism or attempting to compromise with them. It is necessary to stand firm. It would be possible for Jeremy to implement his programme, but to do that would mean to call on the mass of the working class to actively support it, to demonstrate, if necessary, to strike, and to show to the capitalist class, you've got no choice but to let us implement this programme. But even that would only be a beginning. The capitalists would constantly be sabotaging it and attempting to take it back. And therefore it would be necessary to go further, to nationalise the banking system, the finance system, to implement a state monopoly of foreign trade to stop the world markets simply attacking capital controls, to stop the world markets simply attacking what the government was doing. And at the same time, that would be linked to the necessity of a socialist programme, of not just nationalising the finance sector, but what we stand for. Nationalising the major corporations that dominate the economy to begin to build a socialist alternative, a socialist plan of production under democratic control. Now that seems like it's a major thing to put forward, but the fundamentals are the capitalist class will always take back what we win. And the only way to begin to permanently build a society that stands in the interests of majority is to break with capitalism. And I tell you what, in this world we have today, where millions of people are rejecting all of the establishment parties that have not yet drawn socialist conclusions, you got one government that took that stance, that had the active backing of the mass of the population, that was then able to introduce mass council house building, free education, healthcare for all of the basic things, decent jobs. Those ideas would spread like wildfire around the world. And that is what the capitalist class are terrified about. And when they start talking about toying with Keynesianism, we should take heart from that, because what it means is they're frightened. They're starting to think they might have to give the working class a few crumbs because they realise that there is the beginnings of a movement that could not just take a few crumbs but could sweep them from history. So I'll leave that.